Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Tottenham Way. I'm Tom Allnutt from The Times, and I'm joined here with George Sessions from the Press Association. And we are here to dissect what was yet another disappointing home performance from Tottenham. We were hoping it was going to be a big win, statement display at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, but in the end, it felt like a very familiar feeling again, that abject performance, lots of booing, and a real sense of deflation at the full-time whistle, I think. George is bravely at another match already. Here we are on Sunday morning. We didn't quite have time to record post-match last night because I had to get my last train back to Cambridge. I've literally turned on my computer and George is somehow at another Premier League game. He's at the Crystal Palace against Manchester United match. So he's recording from the Palace press room. So if you hear any clinking of plates or sort of background chatter, then that is where George is. We obviously always recording these pods as soon as possible after games, sometimes on the move, sometimes on the go. So just bear with us in terms of some of those teething sound problems every so often. But we should be all good, I think. We should be all good. So, George, we're going to try and be as upbeat as possible because, you know, this is a bit of a doom and gloom time, isn't it? I think we've had such a long kind of 2025 in terms of these kind of home results and these home performances. I've had my coffee. I've made my toast. I'm feeling now like, you know, time to try and dissect this in a kind of analytical way rather than just kind of indulging in the misery, as it were. So let's get into it. I mean, George, we were both there last night. I think we both had sort of big expectations for what Tottenham might deliver, you know, after that PSG game in midweek, that they could possibly kind of launch this Thomas Frank era, but it just didn't happen, did it? So give me your first impressions, you know, the morning after, the night before, what are your reflections?
Well, we're still in that 24-hour period that Thomas Frank talks about, doesn't he? So I think we are going to be a bit downbeat today, unfortunately. I think I was just so disappointed that, and I guess we can probably start with the team. You know, I actually didn't mind the team, to be honest. I was pretty excited to see Lucas Bergwijn and Archie Gray starting together in the Premier League. They asked Thomas Frank that on Thursday, and I thought he might have been kind of bluffing us, sort of saying, "Oh yeah, they're ready to play," and then he wouldn't. He's done that once or twice. With sort of talking about Archie Gray before Leeds, and I looked to the south and I thought, you know what, that can work as long as you've got Randall Colomwani out wide left, because you couldn't just rely on Destiny Udogie to provide the width. And unfortunately, the way it was set up, it was Randall Colomwani more inside with Richardson, and you know, Udogie provided the width, but it didn't really work, did it? And just made Spurs look very predictable, with everything going on the outside. And obviously,
we should say, George, shouldn't we? That we were all kind of pushing for Bergwijn and Gray to start again, weren't we, after the PSG match? And it felt like there were some really encouraging signs from that performance, and that those two really drove that kind of extra bite, extra thrust in terms of the attack and the pressing. So it was quite a kind of brave lineup. Can we say that from Frank, that he sort of put those two in straight away again, presumably with the idea of kind of building on a little bit of momentum?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I said, you know, on social media on X that I think whatever happens here, it is a brave and it is a bold call, because at the end of the day, he's still starting two 19-year-olds in what felt like a must-win game. Obviously, we don't know the consequences of it, but it felt like a really big game for him. And I guess, on one sense, you can say it's hard to judge that team and that system because they can see 2 in 6 minutes, and it's obviously shambolic. And Vicario has an absolute moment of madness, which hope isn't kind of the defining image of his Spurs career, but you do sort of fear that it may be. But having said all of that, after that kind of manic start, and it's obviously terrible, I think you can sort of judge it from maybe about 20 minutes on, where everything's settled down. The fans aren't completely booing every single touch that Vicario has. And again, there just wasn't enough creativity in that setup, and it was just so predictable. You know, I lost count of the amount of times Porro would pass to Kudos, he'd cut inside, he'd whip that ball in, and it'd be cleared first man, or Porro would put in a cross, and it'd be cleared first man. And you know, if it felt predictable to me, and I'm sure I reckon you would agree with me on that aspect, it was obviously predictable to Fulham. So, you know, as much as I was pleased that Thomas Frank put in Archie and Lucas, and yeah, you know, it wasn't the best night for them, it wasn't the best night for anyone, I still think he didn't set the team up in the right way, and the blame has to go on him for that he's decided in a game against Fulham that we're going to ignore the left and just go down the right. I mean, what did you think of the way the players lined up? Because, you know, as you said, we all kind of liked Lucas and Archie in there with Paulinho behind, it kind of felt like it was a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. The Spurs press guys kind of came round before kickoff, as they always do, and sort of said, what do you think of the lineup? And I think generally we all sort of said, yeah, I like it. It looks sort of a bit braver, a bit bolder. We like the Graham Bergvall picks. We all commented on the fact that Xavi Simon's, not starting again. I think, it's not a great week for him, given he didn't start against his former club, PSG. Perhaps you could understand that tactically, get away against a big team. And then also didn't start at home to Fulham, two completely different scenarios. And in both cases, Frank doesn't think he's the right man. But I think, in terms of the lineup, we sort of thought it was okay. I agree with you that the problem was, that first half, really, wasn't it? Particularly because it really framed the contest, I thought. And it was almost like two slightly different scenarios, because then from the second half onwards, they were obviously chasing the game, and they needed to kind of score 3 goals. And you're looking at the pitch, you're looking at the players, and you're looking at this kind of Frank team and thinking, can Spurs really score 3 goals, in this stadium, playing against this team? The way Fulham basically sat back and dropped off and basically said, okay, break us down, try and create chances. I always thought that Spurs might get 1, they might get 2 and kind of scrape a 2-2 draw. But the idea they were going to kind of come back and win 3 or 4-2 or something, just to me, flew in the face of everything we've seen really in the last few weeks. I think it's really difficult when you start like that, in that first 6 minutes, because ultimately everything from that seeped into the game, didn't it? From there on, in that first half, you could see the players were sort of playing with fear and anxiety. The fans, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, with the Vicario thing, because I just felt throughout the whole game, it was more, I've been at the Spurs stadium when it's been angrier, when it's been more toxic, when you felt like there's been a real sort of, the disappointment has been much more vocal and expressed. And clearly there was the boos, but actually I thought the kind of, dominant feeling from the supporters throughout most of the match was just kind of apathy. It's just like we've seen this before, like the deflation, the sense of this again, and I think even in the last kind of 10, 20 minutes when they were chasing, there was that sort of lift when they scored, and they had quite a good spell in the second half where it felt like they were building some momentum. But actually in the last 10 minutes, I don't think Spurs fans were, how can I say this? Like, I don't think they were that bothered about 2-2. Once the kind of the idea of the win had gone out the window, they were like, well, the best thing that can happen here is that we end up drawing 2-2 with Fulham at home. That wasn't really going to get the fans going. And I think, we should get into it really, because people would have seen the goals and the performance. But actually, I think the real thing from this game is, Frank calling out the supporters after the match, right? And saying that, they shouldn't have booed Vicario. And I think it's important to make that distinction, because, I asked him in the press conference afterwards, is it fair, given the record, that here, for you to sort of tell the fans not to express their frustration? And he was very clear. I'm not telling them not to boo, at full time. I just don't think they should boo our own players. But whether in the kind of broad sweep of all this, fans are really going to make that distinction, I don't know. And also, it feels to me that even if Frank has a point, and I personally think he probably does, with regards to booing players, was it the right time to do it? Was it, after that kind of performance, after, given the record? I just didn't think that was necessarily the right message for him to send in the press conference. What did you think about the Frank calling out the booing, George?
To be honest, I admire him for that, because I was sitting there, after the defeat thinking, how is he going to play that? And I kind of wondered if he would be a bit softer and just kind of say he understands the fans' frustrations. But you know what? He is right. I personally don't like booing full stop, but I understand when you've had 3 wins in 21 Premier League, you're going to get boos at half time, you're going to get boos at full time. I've got no issue with that. But I do not like fans booing in the game. How can that help Vicario in any way, shape or form? And look, it was a horrendous mistake. He's had an absolute mare with that. It's hard to even kind of get your head around what he's trying to do with that situation. But Spurs are kind of lucky that he's an experienced guy who has come up through the leagues and has had a hard journey, because if you have a younger goalkeeper in that situation, they'd probably let one in from 30 yards and then it goes 3-0 and then it goes 4-0 and you absolutely annihilate a young goalkeeper's confidence. I thought Vicario handled it well, and he spoke very well after the game, saying he understands the fans' view and they have their right to to express it, which I thought was a very mature response from him, and really, fair play to fronting up. And I guess circling back to Frank, I think he was right when he says that, and I do admire him. I really do. It's not a good time for him, is it? I think he's lost a lot of the fan base during this month, to be honest, but I think especially this week. And I guess where I kind of am now is he losing the players? Because the players look void of confidence, don't they? And they don't really seem to know. I don't personally think what the plan is, other than to pass it to Porro and pass it to Kudos and get crosses into the box and sort of false set pieces and long throws, and even the long throws again horrendously now. And I think that's where I've got major concerns, that I'm struggling to see what he's trying to do, and I'm worried that the players are looking at his sort of tweaks and changes for every game and thinking, what is the plan here? I mean, you've kind of, you had a bit of a back and forth with Thomas Frank yesterday, which is ironic because you're the kind of one out of us four on the podcast that kind of has given him more rope. But do you kind of share that concern that it's kind of hard to see at the minute what he's trying to do with his team, and is he tinkering it too much at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, just to hone in on that Vicario thing. I mean, I do agree with you broadly, but I think it's impossible to analyse that without the context, and I think there's two things. One, it wasn't just an ordinary mistake, if I can say that. Like, it wasn't the kind of thing where someone's just given the ball away or they've, sliced it to somebody, or it was almost like a sort of recklessness, almost like an arrogance, where he kind of dribbles the ball into the corner, which is the first error, when he probably should put it straight into touch straight away. And then there's a sort of swell of, grumbling from the fans, kind of saying, just clear it, that thing where it's kind of like, just get rid of it now, because you can feel the sort of, the Fulham shirts were kind of circling around him. And even then, he made the decision, no, I'm not going to clear it. I'm actually going to try and, whip a ball down the line to try and find, was it Udogie or someone down the left wing. So it was just the two decisions to be made. And as I say, it wasn't a kind of a technical mistake. It was almost as though he sort of could see the pressure. He could see what the fans wanted him to do and what he really should have done. And he sort of just overruled it. It was, I really understood the frustration, I have to say, with that. It was such an avoidable goal. I mean, a great finish, of course, although I would expect a Premier League player to be able to whip a ball in like that from the touchline. But I could understand the fans' frustration. It was such an avoidable goal, and let's say, it's never, I don't think it's never a good thing for fans to boo a player, of course. But George, they've won once in 7 games at home. They've won 3 times, at home in the league all year, and that's been against Burnley, Southampton, and a poor Manchester United team last season. You can't separate the incident from the context, and I think Spurs fans, they're booing Vicario in that instance, but they just had enough. They've had enough of seeing this over and over again. The players just throwing away performances and throwing away these matches at home. And it was also part of this whole thing with the whole week. We've been talking about, okay, there's the North London derby, there's the trip to PSG in the Champions League. 2 on paper stellar fixtures. It would normally be kind of one of the 2 of the biggest games in Tottenham's calendar, but actually, we believed, and I think the players believed as well, if in truth, the biggest game in a way this week was Fulham at home, getting that victory, getting some lift off. To start like they started by making that mistake by Vicario, I think that was just kind of playing and saying, seriously, like really, like after everything we've seen this year, like here at home, and this is how we are, we're 2-0 down after 6 minutes. I mean, I can understand it, I have to say. I can understand. I'm not saying it's right, but I can sympathise with those supporters who pay huge money, who've been going. When I saw something on Twitter, someone saying, that their mate pays 2,300 for a season ticket. So they basically spent 760 odd quid per victory, this season. I mean, that is the context here of the fans' frustration. And I think, let's come to the performance, because I think, in the second half, you're right, George, the challenge was break us down, create chances, try and score goals. And what did we see? Do you think we saw enough in that kind of 15, 20 minutes where they did kind of create a couple of chances, and then they had Xavi Simons, they had the subs coming on maybe at slightly the wrong time because they just scored the goal. It was just kind of give it to Porro, cross it into the box, hope for the best. Give it to Kudus, cross it into the box, hope for the best. I mean, are we seeing enough, in terms of the kind of Frank style and strategy at the moment to think that he can actually really turn this team around?
Well, that is part of it. You are right. they're not booing Vicario, they're booing the team and the results and the style of football. And look, if we've said it a few times, if you pay that much money, one, you want to win games, but if you're not winning games, you want to be entertained. And I'm not sure what the XG was last night, but I know it was under 1 again. And there's been too many games like that, hasn't there? Wolves at home was really poor. Bournemouth was terrible at home. Chelsea was obviously the big one we all talk about. And I guess, just sort of going back to my earlier point, after, and I use myself as an example, I sort of think Thomas Frank's overthinking it a little bit, actually. After Wednesday night, I was kind of on the Euro start back, and I'm sort of thinking, how can you fit in Archie Gray, Lucas Bergvall, João Palhinha, and Xavi Simons, and Wilson, and Cola? And I'm sort of sitting there, and I'm sort of racking my brains, and I kind of come up with a 4-2-2-2-2. Is that right? And it was Odegaard and Colomwani kind of down the middle, but they can both go wide. Xavi and Bergvall as the 10s, and then Gray and Alina. And then kind of 10 minutes later, I sat there and thought, actually, why am I just not playing 4-2-3-1 and just keeping it simple and putting Xavi as a 10, Odegaard left, Kudus on the right, Colomwani down the middle, and you have to drop one of back, Bergvall or Gray. And I think that kind of sums up where Frank's at. I think every game he's kind of so not just concerned with the opposition, which I think is a fair criticism of him. I think he's just desperately trying to work out what's the right formula and changing it every game. And we just don't see, what are we now? 21 games in, he almost got appointed 6 months ago. June the 12th, I think, wasn't it? He got appointed. We're only 2 weeks off that day. And there's no cohesion in the team. There's no relationships. There's no kind of, we all know he's probably his best back 5, although maybe you don't know if it's Spencer or Doggy, but ahead of that, I don't think any of us could say Thomas Frank will 100% pick this team. And of course, he has to make changes because Spurs play every 3 days. But he certainly could try and get more of a solid team from Saturday to Saturday. And I've said it a few times, at home, play Doggy left back, play Odegaard on the left, forward, play Xavi in the 10. And look, his treatment of Xavi is a big concern. And look, Xavi has not pulled up trees, not by any stretch, but I personally felt like he was getting into a little bit of a groove. It was real baby steps, but he was good at Leeds away. Thought he did okay against Aston Villa, okay at Everton. And then you drop him against Chelsea, which I don't think would have been good for his confidence against a club that he obviously wanted to join. And he comes on in that game, doesn't do a lot, fair enough. Again, I think he does pretty well against Copenhagen. I think he plays pretty well against Man United, in the context of him having a really poor season. But there's little baby steps there. And then you have this 3-game week, you leave him on the bench for every match. You're killing his confidence. And then people wonder why he comes on and doesn't look brilliant. He's a 22-year-old that's just moved to a different country. He's got a big price tag on his head. And yeah, he's got a lot of experience for a 22-year-old. But he can't be feeling in a great moment if he's not starting at home to Fulham. And I think Frank's kind of treatment of Xavi is almost kind of a wider discussion here. Is he sort of causing more harm than good at the minute with some of his decisions? Because look, I take the point. It's not the best squad in the world. It certainly isn't. It's not a top 5 squad. Let's be honest about it. But the question is soon going to come. Would this squad look better under a different manager playing a better attacking philosophy? And I think some fans would say that they're already at that point and they think it's time to move on. I think these next couple of weeks feel massive for him because no one's ever going to, I'm certainly not going to endorse anyone losing their job, and he's a human being at the end of the day. And I think Thomas Frank's a good guy. Everyone says that. And I feel for him at the minute because he's a Tottenham manager and I'm a Tottenham fan and I want it to work, but I'm really struggling to see where he turns this around. And I think the big question we have all been asking is, how does he turn it around? I think the question is maybe, does he turn it around? And I'm starting to think he doesn't, to be honest.
It's interesting what you mentioned there about the 3 days thing, because I wonder if that's quite a big part of this, and you're talking about rotating the team a lot, changing the shape a lot. And of course, we shouldn't ignore that when he first started, we all said that was, I think a big strength of Frank, that he was tactically agile, that he could change his team. We were sort of looking forward, I think, to a manager, who took into account the opposition, and came up with kind of bespoke plans. But it feels like they've sort of lurched. My brother James put this quite nicely. They've gone from one manager who completely ignored what the opposition does to a manager who basically only thinks about what the opposition does, and there is sort of a balance there, right? And it feels like Frank, his whole kind of ethos is to think so much about every game, to chop and change and to come up with a strategy. Is that possible when you're managing a club like Spurs? Because the training time is so reduced, and he said this a few times, just kind of mentioned it in passing, and I've noticed it in press conferences where he doesn't want to kind of lay it on too thick, but the fact that he said it quite a few times, and the 3 days, and the 3 days, and the lack of training time, he always adds that in. I think he's finding that hugely difficult, because I think he's used to at Brentford having, a nice full week where he can go over all the weaknesses and the strengths of the opposition, and he can come up with a brilliant formation and a brilliant strategy that really fits every match. At Spurs, you're having to do all this on the go. You're having to basically tell your players the tactics through video analysis sessions. Tell them on the way back, on the bus, on the plane. You're not getting that time. And I wonder, is Frank realizing quickly enough that actually he has to be a manager who has a more consistent approach? Because ultimately, when you're managing the big six teams, or top eight who are in Europe, and you've got so many more games, it's probably not possible to tweak and shift and turn as much as he wants to. And you're right, George. The result is that you have a lot of players who are slightly lacking confidence, I think, lacking rhythm. I wonder if they're sort of lacking a little bit of buy-in, a bit of loyalty, because actually I sort of look at the team and I think, who are his lieutenants? Who are the ones who, there's always going to be, when a new manager comes in, there's always going to be players who get slightly left by the wayside, and they'll be the ones who kind of say, I don't like the new guy, But there should be 6 or 7 who are really buying in. And I'm looking at the team now and I'm thinking, who are those guys who really think that their careers are getting better under Frank? Possibly Van der Ven, I think, has been good, and he's sort of gone up in status, vice captain. I think last night you could see Van der Ven was really kind of trying to drag the team. And we should say there are a couple of brilliant last-ditch tackles and interventions from Van der Ven that basically not only kept Tottenham in the game, but sort of saved them from going 3 or 4-0 down, essentially. But there aren't many in the team, I don't think, who would kind of pin their stripes to Frank and say, yeah, this guy is really believing in me and playing me every week and is making me better. And that is a big part of this, because also one of the reasons Tottenham appointed Frank, and they said this overtly in the statement, player and squad development, proven track record of developing players. Look through the team, and the squad, which players have really got better under Frank in this first 3 months. And it's a difficult comparison to make because they were terrible, a lot of them, in the second half of last season. And some of them, you're just saying, okay, well, they're on the pitch. Like someone like Van der Ven, just the fact he's fit basically means he's better. But there aren't many players in that team right now where you say, yeah, Frank has come in and he's really rejuvenated them, give them a new lease of life. I'm thinking players like Johnson. I'm thinking Bergvall, Gray, Odebear, even sort of Richarlison. There aren't Porro, Doggy. You've got a lot of players who are sort of still doing the same sort of things, and there are a few who have gone backwards as well. And if the whole idea of Frank was that he's a good coach, he's going to get into players technically and improve them and take kind of 6 out of 10s and make them 8 out of 10s. We haven't really seen that, have we, in the first 2 or 3 months? And the problem he has, I think, is you're right. They're getting worse, not better. Because in the first couple of months, we were pointing to things like better defensive record, look more organised, better away from home. But all of that is kind of evaporating, and all the bad things, the lack of creativity, the lack of unity with the fans, all of that is kind of getting worse, and that's the problem, isn't it?
That is the problem. It does feel like he's not kind of learning from that. I think the 3 home games in a row, I felt was kind of a really important week for him. He obviously had the Chelsea game, and I felt like for that Chelsea game, he moved away from quite a good thing in terms of Xavi as the 10. I think they were sort of playing 2 10s then, wasn't it? It was Xavi and Bergvall as the 2 10s. And he moved away from that and kind of went like for like to kind of midfield 3 to match up Chelsea's obviously very good midfield, in fairness to them. But I kind of hoped after that game and after the kind of reaction from the fan base to what was obviously a horrendous attacking display, I kind of hoped Copenhagen, Man United, he's going to realise at home you've got to be on the front foot, you've got to take it to the opposition. And Copenhagen was obviously a good performance and result. And it was in the sort of the 4-2-3-1 that I'm kind of crying out for almost. And having those relationships with Udogie, Odegaard on the left, Xavi as the 10. And he just keeps changing it, doesn't he? Let's look at this week in isolation. He's got 5 at the back at Arsenal. he's played the kind of the two, either a flat 4-4-2 or 4-2-2-2 at PSG, and then on Saturday it was a 4-2-3-1, but without a left forward. Basically, Colomani is inside. It's three different formations, different personnel, and look, it is hard to juggle it when he's got 3 days a week. But I think he can kind of now 8 of the starting team that he needs to build around. And look, we always kind of reference Pochettino, don't we, when we talk about Frank, because we're all sort of hoping that he's going to be the Pochettino and he's going to have his Pochettino moment. But Pochettino was sort of sticking with a kind of pretty consistent team by now. He had Eriksen in there, and then Kane was in there, then Ryan Mason was in there, Eric Lamela was always playing. He was kind of trusting those younger guys. And it's hard to see with Frank the players more from the attacking point of view than a defensive. It feels like we know his best back five in Palhinha always plays, obviously. But from the attacking point of view, which is what he needs to be really working on right now, we just can't see anything marrying up. And I guess these next 2 games, Newcastle away and then Brentford at home, which feels like a horrible game for him at the minute, I think he would be minded to sort of almost play as consistent a team as he can. Don't go away to Newcastle and worry about what they're going to do. Play 4-2-3-1 and take it to Newcastle. Newcastle just won very well at Everton. But for that Man City win, they was in a bit of a difficult moment themselves. There's a lot of questions being asked of Eddie Howe, and he's nowhere near being in trouble. But there was a lot of sort of a little bit of unrest, I think, about how they were going. And he has struggled with the 3 games a week, and everyone does. Ange did last season. It's kind of, there's such a churn on all these squads, and you need a squad like Chelsea really to cope with it. But even if you look at kind of Chelsea as an example, Maresca doesn't make wholesale changes, 5, 6 from what I can see every game. He takes Esteval out, he keeps Pedro Neto in, he puts in Garnacho. He's not sort of making wholesale changes. It's just tiny tweaks. Whereas it feels like Frank is completely ripping up the scripts every 3 days, and as you said, Tom, it can't be easy for the players to be kind of getting to grips with that and getting the buy-in. And I guess the kind of the style of play point of view is a big issue. Now, how can the players go from Ange and always wanting to be on the ball, never hit it long? We always keep the ball, we always look for the option forward, to then Thomas Frank, who's kind of bypassing the midfield and just hasn't got those same patterns of play. It's such a big culture shift. And from that point of view, does he need more time? Well, maybe he does, but if things carry on, then Spurs are going to be Spurs are 10th right now. That's before Man United have played. And well, with time we get to Brentford at home, you don't know what position they're going to be in. And then they go away to Forest after that. Forest are only 6 points behind Tottenham at the moment. I don't think anyone thinks Tottenham are going to get dragged into a relegation battle, but it's hard to see where this gets better in the short-term future, unless he can stick with something. And the signings that he's made in Xavi and Colomani and Kudos can start to come to the fore, because at the minute, the window that looked pretty good on paper, and I think they are good players, Xavi, Colomani, Kudos, Palhinha. At the minute, even those guys aren't really coming to the fore, and that's a bit of a damning indictment on Frank, unfortunately.
Guys, if you're listening, please do try us on YouTube. We're definitely sort of picking up over there and getting more and more subscribers every week. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please do give us a like and a subscribe, because we get lots of watchers, but sometimes not everyone who's watching is subscribed. So please do click that button. It really helps us. I think there is some sort of hype button going on YouTube, which I have no idea what it means. But if you click it, there's loads of sort of points and thumbs up and everything, which kind of looks and feels quite good. So I don't know, hype us as well if you want to. And yeah, keep us in mind as well on social, because we're on Instagram putting up pictures of our trips to Paris in the week and these kind of games, and obviously on X as well, where Marcus mainly is giving his views. So do please sign up to the Tottenham Way in as many ways as possible. And if you want to vent or give us some questions or some topics to talk about, then do give us an email as well, the Tottenham Way pod @gmail.com. It's the Tottenham Way pod @gmail.com. Yeah, George, I mean, I guess, the big question really, isn't it? I mean, we were talking at the start of last week, and I remember kind of laying down the sort of template of what a good week would look like, when we're looking at the Arsenal game, PSG and Fulham at home. And I remember saying, that avoid a thrashing, a pleasant surprise, and beat Fulham at home. That was kind of what Frank needed. To be honest, we sort of got the pleasant surprise-ish, I think, with a decent performance in Paris. But we also got a thrashing, and we also got not winning at home to Fulham. So I think we can definitely say it was not a good week for Frank. And these two games, as you say now, look particularly precarious, I think. Away at Newcastle, where Spurs fans will have lots of terrible memories, to be honest, from the recent years. Newcastle very strong at home. I think Tuesday night is quite a kind of quick turnaround, big trip. I've got to say, it doesn't look like the kind of game where you're expecting a sort of a big performance and a big win from Spurs, especially with the confidence of the players on the floor. That said, Spurs are second in the table in terms of the away form, and that is the real quirk, isn't it, of all of this? It's the home form that is the real problem. They're second bottom of the table. Only Wolves are worse. That was the case also in last season, where only West Ham and Wolves were worse among non-relegated teams. If Spurs could play and gather the points that they get away from home, they'd be second in the league, and they'd be right up there. But clearly, it's the home form that is the big asterisk of the Frank tenure, and it's something that predates him, but it's also something he hasn't been able to fix. And I think if we think about the sort of the main objectives of appointing Frank, we talked about developing players and squad development. But I think also unity, is a big thing, wasn't it? And I think Ange was quite good on this, where he basically said he did a few things at Spurs. But one of the things I think he admitted he didn't quite get right, or wasn't able to kind of fix, was that sense of unity. And clearly when Ange was there, it was mainly around, the discontent was around Daniel Levy. Levy's now gone, but we're still seeing, inside the stadium, at home matches, and around the club, around the manager, a real sense of dejection and separation at the moment. And I think you have to wonder, does Frank have the charisma? Does he have the connection? Does he have the style of play that I think is going to rally not only the players, but also the supporters behind him? I guess, the other thing really, because after Newcastle away, it's Brentford at home. And clearly that will, a lot of people would be saying, wouldn't it be sort of cruel irony if Frank's last game, if you like, was against his former club, where he obviously built his reputation so much. But I also just wonder, what do Spurs do? What are their options, mid-season? Even if this week goes badly, and let's put our kind of, glass half full to the side just for now. If it goes badly and it doesn't happen against Newcastle, it doesn't happen against Brentford, if the board are sort of sitting down next weekend and looking at their options, what are their options? At this point in the season in November, it'll be, early December by the end of the week. Where can they turn, other than kind of sticking with Frank, for the next few months? Do you see an option where they could pivot mid-season to another manager? Do they go with Matt Wells until the end of the season and basically write the season off, another season off, with 3 or 4 months to go? It feels that one of the biggest cards, and that Frank has at the moment, is that there isn't really a really serious alternative that's ready to go. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that is kind of part of the conundrum at the minute, isn't it? I don't feel, I know it is our job, I don't feel massively comfortable talking about kind of who's going to replace Frank. I know we do have to get into that discussion because it feels kind of close to that point. I guess just to sort of take a step back, and I don't enjoy saying this, but I think it just kind of highlights that Spurs probably could have just kept Ange, and I don't think they would have really, if they're in this situation now, then you just know that it's not worked, and it's kind of, it was absolutely the right decision to get rid of it. But even you look at Ange's record at this point last season, Spurs have won more games, they've got more points, they've scored more goals, they've conceded less goals, and he did it. He had Kulusevski, Solanke, and Maddison. That's true, but he didn't have Kudos, Kalomani, and Xavi, Malina. He didn't have even Kevin Danso. So, kind of, it's kind of a really difficult time for Frank, and it just makes you question the decisions. And look, I really like Vinay, and I feel like Vinay Venkatesham's come in and done a lot of good things at Tottenham. You speak to people and, we can already see that the communication and the transparency in his decision making is, it's 10 times better than what happened before. But it feels like Frank was his man. And I think there was a big discussion about kind of this 10 points that he kind of met, and he kind of ticked all the boxes in terms of what Tottenham manager needs. And that kind of is concerning, really, when you think of the style of play that he's delivering at the minute. And look, as much as I didn't think Spurs should get ahead of it, I don't think there's a world where Ange comes back, because Spurs are not going to admit two mistakes, are they? That they got it wrong sacking Ange and got it wrong appointing Thomas Frank. They might admit one mistake, that they got it wrong with Thomas Frank. Look, who do you go with next? It's tricky. I think it probably would be Matt Wells, I guess, until the end of the season, and then you've got post World Cup a lot of very high profile managers potentially available, including Mauricio Pochettino, Thomas Tuchel, Julian Nagelsmann. Yeah. I think the club probably would think that they could get those guys. Whether they can is a different story. I'm sure they could get Poch if he was available, but in the immediate future, it is Thomas Frank. And as I say, I feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about what next for him. And look, I struggle to see how he turns this around. But to be honest, if Spurs, if he gets on a settled team and Spurs go to Newcastle and win, and then they go to Brentford and win, results change everything. Results completely lift the mood. And what's he got? He's got Newcastle, Brentford, and then he's got Slavia Prague. If they beat Brentford and Slavia Prague, he's won 2 at home in, which God knows when Spurs last won 2 games at home. It might be the turning point. He might have his kind of Pochettino Aston Villa moment. But at the minute, it's hard to see him landing on, 1, a consistent 11, 2, a consistent formation, and 3, a consistent style of football, because it's chopping and changing every week. But I think if he is to turn this around and to kind of be a long-term success at Spurs, which is what everybody wants if you're associated with Tottenham, because if he's a long-term success, then Spurs are having success. I think he needs to stick with something. And I, me saying that, what I would be doing is, 1 or 2 changes, obviously, but I'd be saying Udogie, left back, Romero, Van der Ven, Porro. I probably would go Bergvall and Palhinha, or maybe even Benticom and Bergvall. I'll be playing Odobel on the left, and I'd have Xavi as the 10 and Kudos, and then maybe you bring Johnson in for one of these games on the right, and then Colomani up front. He's got to be sticking with that kind of settled team. He's got to stop chopping and changing it. Stop mixing it up with the systems. He's got to stick with something for this next week. And look, it's probably hard to go from Saturday to Tuesday, but Tuesday to Saturday is a big period. And then I think, really, let's be honest, Slavia Prague Spurs should be beaten, so he doesn't really need to make too many changes in that game. He's got to get wins this week, and there's got to be a kind of semblance of a balanced team, I think, if he is going to turn it around. But clearly, Brentford feels a big one for him.
Yeah, I guess if we reset, George, this kind of what does he need from this week, then maybe we think, don't get embarrassed away at Newcastle. If they can, I don't know, is that bar too low? I mean, maybe we say, okay, get a point at Newcastle, or at least it needs to be a compact, sort of organised performance where they go up there and put on a decent display. Don't get blown away. And then I think he needs 2 wins, doesn't he, from Brentford at home and Slavia at home. I don't think another kind of draw or another defeat in either of those games, that's only going to crank up the pressure even further. So last week was a big week. I think this week is an even bigger week. I guess the one thing, and I tend to agree with you. I think, that Spurs have to sort of stick with Frank. It's still early. This is still a dip, that's it doesn't feel good, does it? The vibes don't feel good and the eye test doesn't feel good. And clearly after a performance like last night, everything does feel, quite sort of precarious. I guess the one thing is that you look at the league right now and you think, well, the top 5 this season, I think, is quite gettable. I don't see, there's 2 or 3 teams in there that you think are definitely going to be there, but I think there are 2 spots that are really up for grabs. And the gap right now, I think, is 3 or 4 points, In 2 or 3 weeks, that gap could be 10, 11, 12 points, and it could be gone. I just wonder if the board might look at it and think one reason to act more decisively would be to kind of keep them in the race for the Champions League. if they wait and wait and wait and it gets to January, February, then it could be gone. And we saw this last season, didn't we, with Ange, where I think, Tom has said that, in his book that the considerations of getting rid of Ange much, much earlier in the season were definitely there. But they had the Europa League campaign that basically always gave them that focus. Tottenham don't really have that this season because, no one thinks they're going to win the Champions League. So if they want to keep in that kind of top 4, top 5 race, and it feels like a stretch, to kind of bring in another manager and think that suddenly they're going to be transformed into a top 5 team, I just wonder if that might make them think about, changing sooner. That said, I think it's worth, what we said before, that Spurs really see Frank and have seen Frank at the centre of this restart, that he's been really integral to a lot of the appointments that have been made on and off the pitch. They like him. His positivity, I think, around the club has been a real breath of fresh air. They really want Frank to work. I think they'll give him as much time as they possibly can. But as always with these things, eventually the results take over, don't they? They generate a narrative of their own. And I think if they keep failing to deliver, particularly at home, and as you say, if they slide down the table kind of into the bottom half, and if sort of the bottom 4 or 5 suddenly kind of comes into view, then I think that's going to be a real problem for him. But where the club go, mid-season, really isn't obvious to me, I have to say. Go on.
Yeah, just jump in. Do you think Pochettino would leave United States to come back now? If it just this is not from what just purely as a kind of opinion. Do you think they could? He obviously has got a massive affection for Tottenham. He wants to come back. We know that. Do you think he would give up the United States job to come back now if it become available?
All those American journalists who have been sort of really praising him recently and really getting behind Poch suddenly would be very disappointed. I mean, I have to say, Pochettino has really invested in this American job because of the idea of managing a World Cup, and managing a host nation like the US. He's done a lot of the hard yards already, and I don't think Poch has particularly loved some aspects of being an international manager. It goes against a lot of the sort of things that he loves about coaching, which is the sort of the intensity and the unity in the day-to-day. But I guess, would he leave a job 6 months before sort of the World Cup is about to start? Just as he's kind of generating some momentum as well with that team, it looks like he's suddenly kind of really getting some buy-in from the players and getting some results. I have to say, I don't see that. I don't see it. And could he do both jobs, for the second half of the season? I mean, the March international break, and then there's a kind of a 2-week camp before the World Cup in the summer. But can you really prepare for a World Cup? Would you, prepare a serious country for a World Cup whilst also doing a Premier League job where you're, basically doing games every 3 days? I don't think a serious World Cup team would accept that. I don't. I think it's borderline disrespectful, I would say. I don't think even Poch could get away with that. So unless he's, able to really sort of, I don't know, charm, the US or Spurs, I can't really see it, I've got to say, before the summer. So I think, all those people who are sort of wanting Poch back, or if the club are, and, if Poch is keen to come back, I just think it's a very difficult situation to engineer before the World Cup finishes. Do you disagree with that?
I think you're probably right, yeah. It would certainly be interesting to see Donald Trump's reaction if he does decide to take over at Tottenham and leave the United States in December, 6 months before the World Cup. I think it's probably difficult, but suddenly it feels like Pochettino coming back to Spurs isn't as far away as maybe it may have seemed a few months ago, though. That certainly feels the case.
Well, I think you're right, George. We don't feel kind of comfortable about sort of discussing replacements and debate, but I think it is part of the debate almost about Frank's position. Because if let's say, Pochettino was available, or Xabi Alonso was available and, showed interest in Tottenham, then clearly the situation around Frank is slightly different. If you have someone who's ready to come in, but I think that lack of options, as it so often is in the middle of the season, I think is all part of this discussion. I think maybe we're about the end of this episode. If you've got any thoughts and you disagree or agree with anything we've said in this episode, then please do give us an email. It's the tottenhamwaypod@gmail.com. We'll be back, I think. Next pod will be post Newcastle, so probably late Tuesday night or perhaps Wednesday morning. We'll see who does that one. But thanks very much for listening, hoping for a more positive and better week than the last one. Thanks again. Cheerio, guys.